Welcome back to our second session of the day. One of the side benefits of the crisis has been the reemergence of fiscal policy, which had made a long disappearance in academic circles. And our second session will focus on it. Our speaker today is Tiff Mackliffe, who is our Assistant Deputy Minister of Finance. Associate, sorry. And our discussant is Bob Tetlow, who is replacing Doug Laxton. We're very happy to have Bob come in at the last moment in this way. Bob is, of course, well able to handle that since he's a Carleton graduate. Same format, 45-minute talk, 15-minute discussant, question period at the end where we hope you will still announce your name. So I'll turn this over now to Tiff.
Well, thanks very much, Steve. And let me also thank Chuck and Carleton University for putting together this excellent conference. And I certainly enjoyed the first session. I may not enjoy this one as much, but I know I'll enjoy the others. As Steve was just saying, one of the implications of the crisis is fiscal policy is back. You know, until 18 months ago, academic discussions of fiscal policy, and indeed most of the emphasis among practitioners, was much more focused on the medium term. Fiscal policy, due to the lags in implementation, was not seen as the lead on stabilization policy. Rather, with either implicit or explicit inflation targets, really monetary policy was seen as providing the lead stabilization role, with fiscal policy focusing more on increasing medium-term potential growth. But very clearly, the economic and financial crisis that began about a year and a half ago changed that. I was in Washington with the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance for the November G20 Leaders Summit, hosted by George Bush at the time. And what came out of that summit more than anything was a common understanding and an agreement among the G20 leaders that in the face of the worst global recession since the Great Depression, and almost certainly the most synchronized global recession, monetary policy wasn't going to be enough. Fiscal stimulus was needed. And the IMF, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, very generously threw out a number, 2% of GDP, although it was always recognized that different country circumstances would need to be taken into account, and the number was never terribly precise. What we witnessed really is an extraordinary fiscal response across the G20. And when combined with the monetary stimulus as well as the various other measures, some of which Don talked about to support the financial system, there's no doubt that this played an absolutely instrumental role in averting a much worse crisis. As the declaration in the Pittsburgh summit last September put it succinctly, it worked. Now, as we approach the next of the G20 summits, the Toronto G20 Leaders Summit to be held at the end of June, we're starting to come out the other side. And clearly it's going to be time to start looking very seriously at elaborating clearer fiscal exit strategies. So let's see if I've got the buttons right here. I think it's fair to say that led by the extraordinary policy stimulus provided by the G20 countries, the recovery has proceeded, in fact, better than many expected. In some regions, recovery is now in full swing, and the process of withdrawing stimulus is already underway. In other countries, the recovery is underway, but it is yet to be fully assured, and there is a need to continue stimulus through this year. And in others, what we're seeing is that financial markets are sending clear signals that public debt is now approaching unsustainable levels, and fiscal consolidation plans are going to need to be accelerated. I think for all the G20 countries, exiting from fiscal stimulus going forward and ensuring fiscal sustainability is going to be a critical economic imperative. Now, as might be expected, this series of events has rekindled academic interest in the use and effectiveness of discretionary fiscal policy. And as is often the case in economics, different models are, with different intellectual underpinnings, are producing a range of answers. And I think at the risk of oversimplifying, I think if you sort of the class of models with very few frictions, for lack of a better word, call them real business cycle models, tend to produce rather modest effects of fiscal stimulus. In other words, the government spending multiplier is less than 1. In what I would call more realistic models with wage and price rigidities and other frictions, what you see is that the multipliers tend to be larger than 1. And more recently, there's also some interesting academic literature suggesting that the fiscal multipliers might be considerably bigger than 1 in the situation where interest rates are 0 and the monetary authority finds itself at the 0 lower bound. And I'll have a little bit to say about that. What I thought I could do today is say a few words about, first of all, the design of Canada's fiscal stimulus package, because I think going back to the beginning, this view that fiscal policy isn't the lead stabilization tool because of the long lags, a fair amount of thought went into how to design a fiscal stimulus package to maximize its effectiveness in the situation and ensure a fairly significant fiscal multiplier and get the money out the door quickly. I then want to say a few words about what we can say about the impact of the fiscal stimulus in Canada, and then I want to turn to the other side, the fiscal consolidation, Canada's exit strategy. As well, it's clear that Canada is in a relative to others, extremely good fiscal position. We have by far the lowest deficit and debt in the G7, and across, certainly among the best in the full G20. A number of other countries face bigger fiscal challenges. We went through a bigger fiscal challenge in the 1990s, and I want to reflect back on, are there any lessons from that experience that might inform the fiscal discussion today? So that's the plan. So let me begin with talking a little bit about the fiscal stimulus package we put together in the 2009 budget, which was really carried through in the 2010 budget. So first, a few facts. Canada's fiscal stimulus package is among the largest in the G7. It's in fact among the largest in the G20, although there are some bigger, particularly China's is very large across the G20. And as I mentioned at the outset, this was really part of a global strategy to provide fiscal stimulus in the face of an extraordinarily severe crisis. The other key part, of course, of the role of fiscal policy are what we usually call automatic stabilizers, which are related to the fact that as the economy slows, tax revenues decline and a number of expenditures tend to increase. And it's important when you're looking at the total impact of fiscal policy to consider both the discretionary elements as well as the automatic stabilizers. And different countries have different degrees of automatic stabilizers. In Canada, this is an estimate based on sort of combining both IMF estimates of output gaps and OECD estimates of the automatic stabilizers in our various countries. And you can see that Canada's kind of the middle of the pack here. And there are two main sort of automatic stabilizers in our system, the tax system and the employment insurance system. So in terms of the effectiveness in fiscal policy in providing short-run stimulus, there are a few key sort of dimensions that economists look at. The first is the role of monetary policy, whether the fiscal stimulus is accommodated by the monetary authority. And as I'll say later, in the unique situation when monetary policy rate is effectively zero or at the zero lower bound, there are reasons to believe the effects may be somewhat different. The second is the degree of leakage. Leakage comes really from two places. One is imports. If you provide more income, for example, to your citizens, they buy things. Some of those are imported, so some of that stimulus goes to other countries. Now, because the G20 was all doing this together, and that was really an important reason to do it all together, our exports were their imports and vice versa. So there's reason to believe that leakage, not as big of a problem this time around, given the coordinated nature. The other part, of course, is savings. Savings is generally a good thing, but when you're trying to provide stimulus, you want spending, and so you want to design the program to maximize spending in the near term. Certainly, economics will tell you that the degree to which agents are forward-looking, we sometimes use the word Ricardian, that will affect the short-run multipliers. The more agents see to the future and realize that this will have to be somehow paid for in the future, economic theory tells you the less the short-run impact. And this can interact with the perceptions about the sustainability of fiscal policy. If you're in a situation where fiscal sustainability is in question, this forward-looking element may come more into play. Of course, in Canada, debt levels are relatively low, so this is less of a factor. And then finally, as I emphasized at the top, speed of implementation. You've got to get the money into the economy to get it to actually start to provide stimulus. And so there needs to be a lot of emphasis on getting it out the door quickly. And there's good reasons to believe that stimulus will have a bigger multiplier when the economy is weak than when it's close to potential. So you want to get the money into the economy while it's weak to maximize the fiscal multiplier. So if you look at the design of Canada's economic action plan, the fiscal stimulus package put together in the 2009 budget, I'm going to quote from the IMF because I don't think I could have put it better myself. Canada's stimulus plan is well diversified and structured for maximum effectiveness. So what was the thinking here? Well, if you look at the breakdown, you've got about a third in infrastructure and housing. There's good reasons to believe that that will have a large fiscal multiplier. It's relatively, first of all, it's not saved. There's relatively small amounts of leakage, and the money's going directly into your economy. There was also about 30% to support industries under severe stress. Part of this was certainly the rescues of the General Motors and Chrysler, which we pursued along with the United States. Clearly, these very interconnected industries and potential for a serious loss in our economy. The measures taken to reduce taxes, economic theory would tell you that you'll get more fiscal multiplier if you focus on low and middle income people and if you make the tax cut permanent. And those are both features of the plan. And then there were a number of measures to protect the most vulnerable, extensions to unemployment insurance and training. And again, you'd expect those to have a fairly significant fiscal multiplier and obviously very significant social benefits. As we put the budget together, we used estimates drawn from sort of various surveys and as well as our own estimates of the fiscal multipliers. And you can see here the estimates we used in the budget. It's around 1.5, a multiplier of about 1.5 for the measures for low-income households and the unemployed, about the same for infrastructure, and around 1 for personal tax. If you compare these to other, we deliberately assumed somewhat modest multipliers. If you compare these to example, what the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors used, they're a little lower, as well as a number of sort of large-scale Canadian models like the PEEP model and the Conference Board model. These are a little on the low side. So there are a number of reasons to believe that the impact should have been fairly significant. As I've already mentioned, Canada has a very sustainable fiscal situation. The composition was designed for maximum effectiveness. And there was a lot of emphasis put on rapid implementation, both in terms of procedures to get this through Parliament very quickly, and a great deal of work across a great many departments in the federal government and the provincial governments to get the money out the door into the economy. And so when we talked about infrastructure, for example, there was very much an emphasis on what we called shovel-ready projects. These are not starting from scratch. These are repairs, repairing roads, sewers, and of course, if you're in Canada, you've got to repair the hockey arenas. The idea was very much things that could be brought in, be done quickly, and it was set up as a use it or lose it proposition to provide an incentive for everybody to get focused and begin work as quickly as possible. As I've already mentioned, because there was a great deal of global coordination, the linkages through imports were minimized. And as I'll say a little bit more in the middle in a second, given that monetary interest rates were very low, in fact, got down to effectively zero in Canada as well as most other G7 countries, this was clearly accommodated, and in fact, at the zero lower bound, as I'll show in a minute, the effects may be even bigger than in normal cases. So this is a simulation from a model, well, it was originally an IMF model, and the Bank of Canada and the Department of Finance have modified it somewhat, built in a little more Canada into it. And as with any model, I really encourage you to take these results with a big grain of salt. I'm not wedded to any of the numbers here, but I think the general picture is illustrative. And so the blue line shows the effects of a fiscal stimulus package when the economy is operating at potential, and so when the stimulus package is added, of course, that'll tend to push upward pressure on inflation. So the central bank will tend to raise interest rates to keep inflation back at the target, and you can see that has a positive effect on economic activity, but it's somewhat modest. The second red line shows what happens if you start with an output gap. So in this case, the Monetary Authority welcomes everything's working in the same direction, so there's no need for the Monetary Authority can accommodate this. And then the third one, the green line, shows what's happening in a situation where monetary policy is at the zero lower bound. And effectively what's going on here is that if you have a potentially very big recession and monetary policy is not enough, and you would get into a period of deflation, the fiscal stimulus has the regular fiscal effect, but it also avoids deflation, keeps expected inflation up, therefore keeps real interest rates lower, and so the potential for the fiscal multiplier is a lot bigger. As I said, this is just designed to be illustrative, and it is somewhat theoretically based, but I think there is good intuition. So what is the actual evidence? So this shows government investment in infrastructure of capital goods, and what you can see is in the last 3 quarters of 2009, it averaged about 20% annual growth, compared to less than half that in the previous period. And the second chart shows you final domestic demand. And what you see is quite a sharp and rapid recovery in final domestic demand in Canada. And that's coming through consumption as well as housing, consumption being affected by the tax measures, the measures to support the unemployed. And on housing, there's the home renovation tax credit as well as the first-time home buyers credit. So in Canada, housing activity was maintained relatively stable and was contributing to growth through this period. You can also look at confidence indicators. Now, obviously, it's hard to be extremely scientific about what exactly is affecting confidence, and I certainly wouldn't want to pretend that fiscal policy was the only thing that was blowing confidence. Monetary policy, the various actions taken to support the financial system, and of course the very global nature of the response all affecting confidence. But what you see is really quite a sharp rebound in confidence, both at the consumer level and the business level. And this was an important element of the actions taken and their coordinated basis. This provides some estimates of what the actual economic impact were. What you can see effectively is that the downturn, so the red line is an estimate based on the actions taken and those fiscal multipliers I gave you at the beginning. And what you can see is that the decline in the second quarter is reduced by about 1.5 percentage points. The third quarter moves from a small negative to a small positive, and then the fourth quarter adds about 2.2 percentage points to growth. And then using Okun's law, effectively, you can map this into employment space, and you see that the action plan created or maintained about 130,000 jobs and is on track to creating or maintaining 220,000 jobs by the end of the year. And in fact, we've seen pretty good employment growth in Canada. This compares Canada to the other G7 countries, and what I want you to get out of this slide is that domestic demand rebounded quite strongly in Canada. And I think there are a number of reasons for this. First of all, balance sheets in Canada were in better shape, both in the household and the corporate sector. Our banking system weathered this crisis much better than others. That meant monetary policy worked. And I humbly present that I think we had one of the most effective front-loaded fiscal stimulus packages, which was also a factor. And certainly overall, this recession, while it's certainly been a bad recession, Canada was the last to enter among the G7. We had among the mildest in the G7, and at least the IMF is projecting the fastest growth in Canada among the G7 for next year. So there's the evidence on how well it worked. And now let's shift to the aftermath of the need for fiscal consolidation. What you see from this slide is that with the exception of Canada, the fiscal situations across advanced countries have certainly been greatly affected by this crisis. The other thing you see is that Canada is really in somewhat of a category of its own. Our debt to GDP ratio in 2014 on this basis, total government net debt at 29% based on the IMF's projections. For most of the other advanced countries, it's around 80%, and then you can see Italy and Japan somewhat above that. And I guess my intent here would be to scare you a little bit. The challenge across the advanced countries is historically large. We're back to debt levels we had after the Second World War, and so there is real work to be done. We are seeing in last several weeks the risks playing out across a number of European countries. This shows a number of countries which have come under market pressure: Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Spain, Italy. And you can see these countries all have reasonably high debt to GDP ratios, and a number of them have seen fairly marked increases in their debt to GDP ratios. And to varying degrees, this has been associated with building sovereign risk premiums embedded in the interest rates in which they have to borrow. And of course, as I'm about to get to, as we learned in Canada in the 1990s, this makes your fiscal situation that much more complicated because you face rising debt service charges. The other element of the challenge, which is somewhat different from what was faced after the Second World War, when there was a baby boom and had a lot of labor force growth in the subsequent years. We're now faced with a situation where we have a rising proportion of our labor force will be retired, and so this has two implications. One, we are going to get less growth from labor force growth in advanced countries, including Canada. And so unless productivity growth accelerates, it's reasonable to expect that potential growth will slow, which will make this challenge more serious. And the other reality is old people use more medical services, and so healthcare costs will be under increasing pressure. So let me, I think I've laid out the challenge pretty clearly. Let me now say a few words on Canada's consolidation experience in the 1990s, and what lessons I think can be drawn from that, and what lessons probably can't be drawn from that because they reflected some specific Canadian circumstances. So just, I think this group is pretty familiar with the story, but this just shows Canada's net debt, and as is well known, I think in the late 80s, a number of fiscal consolidation measures were taken. Those certainly had an impact. They were sufficient to generate a primary surplus, but given that debt was relatively high and interest rates were relatively high, with the debt service charges, they really only sufficed to somewhat stabilize the situation. Then we went into a deep recession in the early 90s. That clearly aggravated the situation dramatically. As Canada came out of the recession, by 1994, the economy had largely recovered, but the deficit had certainly come down, but was stubbornly at about 5% of GDP. And at this point, debt service charges were absorbing about a third of the federal budget. And Canadians began to understand that many of the programs they valued were at risk because debt service charges were taking a bigger and bigger bite out of the revenues. This sense of urgency was then dramatically affected in 1994 during the Mexican peso crisis. And as we've seen in recent weeks, what happens when a country gets into crisis is that risk appetite is scaled back dramatically. And then investors look very carefully at what they've got, and they pull back from anybody that looks risky. And at this time, Canada looked risky. We had a high debt level, and so we started to see dramatic effects on the Canadian dollar. We started to see sovereign spreads back up. And I guess the defining moment was the Wall Street Journal editorial when Canada was proclaimed to be an honorary member of the Third World. This urgency led to a number of fiscal actions, and I'm not going to go through them all in detail, but I guess a few things here. First of all, the focus was first and foremost on the expenditure side. A number of expenditure measures were taken, and these were sufficient to reduce total government program spending from about 40% of GDP in 1993 to 33% in 1997. And to give you a sense of the scale of the turnaround, a government budgetary deficit of about 9% of GDP in 1993 was eliminated in roughly 4 years. In addition to spending initiatives, or initiatives to cut spending, there was also an emphasis on more structural adjustments and fundamental reforms of entitlement programs. And here I would mention the reforms to the unemployment insurance program, as well as the reforms of the Canadian pension plan, which put it on sound footing, so that Canada now is in a situation where the CPP-QPP system is judged to be on a sustainable basis over the long run. When you look at the impact of this on the economy, this shows growth in Canada and the United States. And what you can see, obviously, is that clearly it had an impact in 1996. But I guess the message I want to give you is that by 1997 and 1998, we returned to reasonably good growth. And I think there are a few key reasons for this. One is, if the plan is very credible, identifies specific measures, it actually boosts confidence. Because the worry of an unsustainable fiscal situation is dramatically reduced. That boosts confidence for consumers. It also allows the monetary authority, the central bank, to be much more accommodative and to mitigate some of the real consequences of this fiscal contraction. The other, I think, positive factors I would mention is that Canada was blessed to being in a very good neighborhood. The U.S. growth was strong, and that was very helpful for us in pulling ourselves out and getting back to reasonably good growth. And let's face it, growth is the best way, the easiest way to reduce your fiscal burden. So let me offer a few thoughts on what aspects I think of the consolidation 1990s have some broader application and which don't. In terms of, I think you have to be careful in drawing too many lessons. An important part of the fiscal consolidation were cuts to transfers to provinces against a background where you've got a rising proportion of retired people and which will put a lot of pressure on healthcare costs. I think cutting transfers in the current setting probably not a good idea. Another element is in the 1990s, interest rates were relatively high, and after a credible fiscal plan was announced, the Monetary Authority was able to loosen interest rates fairly substantially. This turned a vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle, where, and so the lower interest rates, of course, reduced debt charges, and in combination with the fiscal cuts, led to a fairly rapid improvement in the fiscal situation. Obviously, with interest rates at very low levels at the moment, it's hard to see that you're going to get as much of a kick through that. However, if you don't do it, you're going to pay in terms of higher interest rates, so I wouldn't diminish that one entirely. And then finally, of course, as I've already mentioned, we were in a good neighborhood, and the U.S. Was very helpful. Strong U.S. growth was very helpful in stimulating our exports, and that may work for Canada, but it's not everybody is so fortunate. But I think there are a few broader lessons that do come out. First is that it's key that the plan's credible, and what that means is that it's a multi-year plan. There are specific measures. They're well identified. It's based on fairly prudent or conservative economic assumptions. So in other words, you're more likely to overachieve than underachieve. And it's if you say what you're going to do and then you start to get good results, that really reinforces the credibility, which is very helpful. I guess the other message is that start as quickly as possible. Don't be too gradual. Making this a clear focus is very helpful. And this allow monetary policy to play its stabilization role. And I guess the third lesson would be to focus more on the spending side and measures that will boost potential growth. Revenue measures may be necessary in some cases, but don't start there. Sorry, tax measures. You need revenue measures. Some of this will, obviously better growth flows into revenues, but tax measures, not the place to start. In terms of what does this mean for the current situation, I think there are some lessons to be drawn, and I've tried to highlight which ones I think are kind of generalizable and which ones are not. I think one thing to keep in mind, sort of getting back to my good neighborhood element, as advanced countries implement fiscal consolidation plans, of course, other things equal, this is going to detract from growth. And this really gets back to the G20. If we're going to realize our objectives of a strong, sustainable, and balanced growth and a sustained recovery, it's going to be important for other countries, particularly surplus countries, to fill in the gap that's going to be created in demand. And so we need some rotation and more balance in growth going forward. And certainly as we move to the Toronto Summit, this thing we call the Framework for Strong, Sustainable, and Balanced Growth is going to be a very important priority, and the current emphasis, the current background around fiscal consolidation, I think will only make that more urgent. So let me just say a few words around Canada's exit strategy. As I've already outlined, Canada's fiscal challenge is considerably less serious than others. But I think just to round this out, let me just say a few words about what we are doing. I think that the first key part to a good exit strategy is that when you're in the entrance strategy, when you're designing your fiscal package, you want to hard code the exit strategy in. And so there were a number of elements of Budget 2009 that did this. First of all, the stimulus was set up as temporary. And as I mentioned, particularly the infrastructure was set up as a use it or lose it proposition. Secondly, there were a number of actions taken, even at that time, to ensure that some elements of government spending were well controlled, and we avoided a structural deficit. In Budget 2010, a key element is commitment to follow through on the exit strategy. Some of the measures have already rolled off. The home renovation tax credit, for example, has rolled off, and Budget 2010 reinforced the message that this is a temporary fiscal stimulus package designed to deal with the worst effects of the crisis. It's working, and as we get into next year, it will be unwound. In addition, to ensure that we do get back to balance, a number of targeted measures, a number of specific measures were built into the budget to constrain the growth of government spending going forward. As well, there was also a number of measures to review various government activities and to look at how to save money, particularly in areas such as overhead costs. So this gives you a picture of what it looks like, and what you see is that the deficits for 09, 10, and 10-11, roughly in the range of $50 billion. That's the effect of the stimulus along with the automatic stabilizers. As the stimulus ends after 2 years, you see the budget deficit is roughly cut in half, and then as the economy continues to recover, the deficit shrinks further. The light blue shows the impact of the additional measures taken in the budget, which really are designed to ensure that we get back roughly to balance by 2014-15. So just to conclude, fiscal policy is back. It's not going away. It has been very helpful in confronting the challenges of the crisis. It's going to be just as important going forward to deal with the other side of this. I think we have learned a certain amount through the crisis in terms of, based on past experience, how to design fiscal stimulus for maximum short-run impact. That was a bit of a mind shift because fiscal stimulus had been focusing much more on the medium term, and so there was a need to shift quickly to, okay, no, it's now to provide maximum short-run stimulus. And I think I'll just conclude by saying that it is going to be important for all countries to elaborate clear, credible exit strategies. And from the academics, we need good ideas, we need good analysis, and we're listening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. As Steve was saying, well, let me begin by thanking the Center for Monetary and Financial Economics for inviting me to participate in this fine conference, and to Chuck Friedman and Steve Ferris in particular, the organizers. I've organized conferences myself, and I know that the work to credit ratio is extremely high, so I should get as much credit as you possibly can while you can. As Steve mentioned, I'm just an interloper here. I'm standing in for Doug Laxton, who apparently is way too busy working on things like fiscal policy and what to do in response to crises to come down here and tell you about what the IMF does and what the institution's views are on these important issues. So I'm actually going to talk in relatively general terms about fiscal policy and what the IMF's models have to say about it and what they can contribute to situations like this. I'm actually not going to have anything directly to say about Canada. I will be talking about model results mostly involving the United States, not because we have a preference for the United States, but because the multi-country models we use, unless you use an extremely large version, they don't have a Canada block on its own. Nonetheless, I think you're going to find that there are some general lessons that can be taken from what I'm to say that are going to touch on some of the things that Tiff mentioned, and in a few cases amplify those. It's gratifying, since I didn't see these comments until really recently, how closely everybody, well, Tiff and I anyway, and the IMF more broadly, think about some of these issues. That I think augurs well for the future, to have everybody pulling their oars in the same direction. So the comments here I'm going to be based on these two IMF working papers, mostly based on these two IMF working papers. If you're counting there, that second one has 17 co-authors, which it just hurts my head just to think about that. And you might think that that'd be like more co-authors than pages, but in fact that paper is about 100 pages long, so that's not true. It actually raised a thought for me about how I might be able to handle my own fiscal deficits. I think I could slip in another co-author in there, and they wouldn't even notice. So if anybody wants to be a co-author in exchange for a small, transaction, I could probably pull that off. Okay, so here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about what contribution structural models in general and the IMF's Global Integrated Monetary and Financial Model, GIMF for short, what they have to say about fiscal policy in general and the coordination of fiscal policy across countries and mostly between fiscal and monetary policy. And I'm going to split that up in some respects. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the long-term effects of government debt, which Tiff alluded to. And then I'm going to show you a temporary fiscal shock as a benchmark about how to think about some of these things. And then we're going to go through just a little tiny bit about the G20 stimulus that's been taken on recently. And I'm going to wrap up, and that's going to be about the size of it. And hopefully I can squeeze that all in 15 minutes. So why would we want to use a model like GIMF? Well, GIMF is, as I said, is the Global Integrated Monetary and Fiscal Model. And it's one of several multi-country models that are built, maintained, and used at the IMF. They're used for multilateral surveillance. They're used for policy analysis scenarios. They're used to give advice in the world economic outlook and that sort of thing. This particular model is pretty well suited for these kinds of issues because it has the structure necessary to assign appropriate roles for monetary and fiscal policy and model how those policies affect individual decision making as opposed to just time series elements. So that's very important. In fiscal policy, you're always talking about trading off something in the short term for some sort of long-term cost or benefit, depending on. And the data, just frequently unassisted by structure, don't tell you very much about what long-term effects are, because it just isn't enough power in the data to distinguish between alternative hypotheses. So you need to have a model that has some structure in it so that you can pin down what those effects might be. That's what stops you from having models that tell you that there's a free lunch. And anytime you're dealing in policy, you want to deal in models that rule out easy, cheap solutions that you should be suspicious aren't going to be true. So that's what structural models do, and this is why they're important. So GIMF's main strengths are involved in how they handle monetary and fiscal policy and how those policies interact. So today I'm going to show you some stuff involving a 5-region version of the model. It has the United States and the Euro area, Japan, emerging Asia, and then everything else. We use, at the IMF, we use a whole bunch of variants of this model. You can tear out countries and replace them with just a bigger rest of world block. You can close it down to a closed economy. You can have 2-region versions we build for training purposes and so forth. So it's a pretty flexible tool, although it is really, in this 5-country version, it's big and complicated. So among the standard GIMF features, it has tradables and non-tradable sectors. They're intermediate goods. They get combined with other intermediate goods to produce final output. There's consumption and investment. There are a whole bunch of rigidities, both nominal and real. But they're all built in blocks that allows us to take things in and out. So you can purge the nominal rigidities to see what effects those are doing and so forth. Now, for our exercise today, GIMF is, as I said, well suited. Tiff alluded to the rigidities that make fiscal policy interesting in his view, and indeed in everybody's view. And so I want to emphasize a few of them that are important in this case. The model has two types of consumers. There's an overlapping generations consumer. This is the Blanchard-Yarry model of perpetual youth. So you have these agents that are in constant fear of dying at any one point, and so that affects their decision making. But otherwise, these agents are rational agents who are on their Euler equations. What that means is, if you're on your Euler equation, there's not all that much scope for temporary tax policy to affect output. There is the discounting of the future that gives some avenue for that, but it's not a big effect that can affect things in the very short run. But that's only one agent. The other agent is a hand-to-mouth agent. They're liquidity constrained. They're liquidity constrained. They consume whatever their endowment is every period. Those are the agents that make fiscal policy somewhat powerful in this kind of environment. Added to the model as well as there's a fiscal accelerator a la Bernanke, Gertler, and Gilchrist. What that does is it tends to amplify shocks from elsewhere in the economy. What the accelerator does is it requires firms to finance their capital investment by going to the market, and then the rate that they face when they go to the market is a function of how much net worth they have in the project. So if you have a shock that increases the value of the firm, then suddenly your cost of doing finance goes down. So this adds this pro-cyclical element to the way finance works in the economy, which of course, as we know, was empirically valid during the late 1990s and into this century. Okay. So here I'm going to run you through a generic fiscal shock in this model. So this is a 10 percentage point increase in the U.S. ratio of government debt to GDP. So that's, how does that, you know, just raise debt? How is that implemented? This is implemented by a temporary cut in the labor income tax rate. And that ends up being an increase in the long run. So if you start in the upper left panel, the thin lines are the first 10 years of this scenario, and then the bars are change the frequency of the data, and they show you what happens over the longer run. This is a very long, drawn-out shock. It didn't have to be this way. It could have been a really big cut in the short run and then a more rapid increase towards the back end. But what it tells you is that in the model, you can get a 1 percentage point cut in income tax rates, provided you're prepared to pay in the long run a 0.4 percentage point increase in taxes forever, right? And so this is what it involves in this kind of environment. Now, normally, if you start off in steady state, this is not something you would necessarily want to entertain because you're already in a happy world. Why would you want to cut taxes for it's like paying for a party, right? Have a big party and then you pay for it with credit card bills down the line. But when you're in an environment like the one Tiff was describing, where you're at a severe recession, there, if you have, say, a quadratic loss function, you're already incurring large losses. Those losses are very costly to you. A small reduction in those losses today is worth more than an increase in the loss way down at 40 years, 50 years out. So you can make a stronger case for doing this at a position when you have a large amount of excess demand. So what is the mechanism how this works? Well, as you can see, the bottom left panel shows that the government debt is increasing over time. And what that's going to mean is that has to be financed. And the bottom right panel tells you that that gets financed by foreigners. The net foreign asset to GDP ratio rises. And then you have to have the funding to pay that balance, to maintain that balance. That is done, as you can see by the upper left panel, by, in the long run, running a trade surplus. And that trade surplus means that you, in the long run, new steady state, you get to consume less of your potential output. So that's what you're seeing in the upper right panel. So you see that this expansion, this labor income tax cut allows consumption to rise about 0.75% in the short run. Here, this lasts a long time in this case. But then you have to consume about 0.5% less, that's the blue bar at the far right, for the rest of infinity. And that's so that you can produce the trade balance to fund that current account deficits there in the long run. The other mechanism going through here is, this is not a small open economy, so the United States is drawing savings from the rest of the world in large amounts here. In order for that to be in equilibrium, the world real interest rate has to rise, and that's what you're looking at in the bottom right panel. And so that's going to lower potential output for the United States and for the rest of the world as well. So obviously the circumstances under which the policy is undertaken have a big effect about whether it's a good policy or not. So what are the so that's the generic shock. What are the long-term implications of government debt? Well, I've already mentioned it to you. And it's going to turn out, this generic shock I did for you is for consumption, is for a particular kind of tax, but the costs are a function of how these deficits are financed in the first place. So, and as I said, there's already crowding out effects. So here in this table, we show the long-run implications of a permanent 10% increase in government debt. This is the same shock I showed you before. But we show it in different ways. In this case, excuse me, no, that's the next slide. In this case, it's financed by a cut to transfers. And so here are the long-run effects. As you can see, because of the effect on the equilibrium real interest rate, in the long run, U.S. output is down by about a 1/4 percentage point. Now, that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but remember, that's a permanent effect, and so that can be pretty significant. The rest of the world is not unaffected by this. They face the long-run real interest rate as well, so there's a permanent decline in potential output in the rest of the world as well. That's driven by the modest but permanent 10 basis point increase in the world real interest rate. That's the second line. And as I have already mentioned, the current account has to be is more negative, and that's to service the net foreign asset position. That last line is what tells you about is the true hint about what welfare is. Savings rate has to rise, which means consumption is lower. So not only is potential output lower, but the domestic citizens in the United States consume less of it than they otherwise would. Okay. It matters how you finance these things. And so the first line repeats the first line of the last table. It shows you that in the U.S. you're down about a 1/4 percentage point in GDP when this increase in debt is financed by a cut in general transfers. However, if you finance it instead by labor income taxes, that creates a distortion that reduces the amount of labor offered by U.S. residents. And so that's a bigger distortion, and that reduces GDP by 0.4%. Capital income taxes are even worse because that reduces potential. It's a more profound reduction in reduction of potential. And among these taxes in this model, as is usually the case in most models, the consumption tax is the most efficient of the three that are under consideration here. And you can see, once again, that it has effects on the rest of the world that are all negative as well. Okay. So now we're going to talk about temporary fiscal shocks. So the bottom line of what I'm behind time here. So I'm running behind on time. But the bottom line of what this is going to be is that as you know, there's a lengthy debate about what the fiscal multiplier is, as if there is such a thing. And of course, there are empirical issues that I've already mentioned about how it is difficult to identify long-run effects, for example, or for that matter, even short-run effects. I don't doubt for a second that those are quite relevant. But one of the reasons why people debate these things is it's not entirely clear what a fiscal multiplier is. It's not a structural feature of any model. Anytime someone asks you what's your fiscal multiplier, your immediate question, if you're an economist working on these kind of issues, is what do you mean by that question? What's the context? So we're going to do a couple of shocks here. We're going to do a government investment shock and a targeted transfer shock. And these are just illustrative. Tiff mentioned, he didn't use these words, but he mentioned the Ned Gramlich's trilogy of things that you want from fiscal policy, that you want to be targeted, temporary, and what's the third one? Timely, thank you. Targeted, temporary, and timely. It's very important to keep in mind when I'm going to show you, I'm going to show these investment shocks, that it's easier to say you're going to do investment in a shovel-ready, fast, right off the bat way. It's actually, especially when you do it in large scale, it's much harder to do. That's not going to be in here. We're just going to pretend that we can do that, and it's debatable, I suppose, how easily it is to do that. So here is the fiscal expansion using government investment. What you can see there in the upper left is the multiplier here is about 1.25. It's a 2-year shock, 1% of GDP, so you get a little bonus. And this is in a version of the model that allows the interest rate to respond immediately. So this corresponds to one of the cases that Tiff was mentioning. And the upper row is without the financial accelerator in the model turned on. The bottom row is with the financial accelerator. As you can see, the financial accelerator at this point doesn't actually make very much difference. If you, to emulate what happens when you're at the zero lower bound, if you require that policy remain at baseline for 1 year, then you get the blue line, which raises the multiplier sum. And if you're at 2 years, now the multiplier is quite high, 1.6, 1.7, something like that. So again, this reinforces the idea that Tiff was mentioning, that at times monetary policy and fiscal policy work against one another, and at times they can be accommodating. And it's important when designing policy to have an idea of what that's going to be. Okay. I'm going to skip this. So here's okay, this is the rest of the world. As you can well imagine, when it's a large U.S. Shock, it has some rest of the world effects, but I think you would agree that these are fairly unimpressive here. If the policy sits on the sideline for quite some time, then it gets up to be something that people would actually care about. But again, the interaction between monetary fiscal policy and interaction between the U.S. and the rest of the world are important. Okay. So now targeted transfers. Targeted transfers are transfers that are given solely to our hand-to-mouth consumers. So in this case, so this is the ones that are going to build up the multiplier for transfers as much as possible. Here, the effect of targeted transfers is normally thought of in like blogs as being a huge effect. Here, they really aren't that impressive. They're not particularly large. You see the upper left panel, it's about 0.8. And again, as always, if policy sits on the sideline, either because it has to or because it chooses to, the multipliers get larger. Let's skip this part too. So now I want to talk just for a couple minutes about the G20 Stimulus Package. And this comes from, actually Tiff used the same source for one of the charts that he used. This comes from a report by the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF in November of 2009. And so what this is telling you is how much the IMF thinks the fiscal stimulus that the individual countries have done is doing for their economies and for the economy as a whole. The diagonal there in bold is what you're probably mostly interested in. It says that for the level of GDP in 2009, the United States fiscal stimulus has raised the level of GDP by about 1.5 percentage points. That's a fairly significant number. You remember Tiff had these bar charts where he showed more or less in order of size who had the largest fiscal stimuluses, and Japan and the US were over on the left, and way over on the far right were countries like Germany and Italy and France that weren't doing very much stimulus at all. And you can see that that's reflected there in the small fiscal stimulus shown for the Euro area for 2009. Japan has a large stimulus, and emerging Asia as well. The line on the column on the far left shows the summation of these effects across countries, and here again you can see that by all countries operating together in the same direction, there's some spillovers that increase output for everybody. Skip. I'm out. Okay. All right. So I'm out of time, so I want to come to the conclusion. The conclusion here is, as Tiff was mentioning off the top, fiscal policy as a tool for battling business cycles was long out of favor for quite a long time. It's come back. And it raises the interesting question, why is that so? I mean, the obvious answer is because just look out the window, stupid. That's why. But taking it more seriously, the current situation, at least in the United States, is reflected by, in spite of incentives to the contrary, private sector's unwillingness to spend. The savings rate in the United States has gone up significantly from what it was prior to this recession coming along. And so there's a need for something in policy to go and augment that domestic spending or encourage that domestic spending. In the United States and in other countries, the zero lower bound doesn't prevent that because there are these extraordinary policies as well that Don Cohn was telling us about. But it is fair to say that those policies are inhibited by the zero lower bound. And so something else has to step into the breach. In addition, one of the usual complaints about fiscal policy as a stabilization tool is it's difficult to get the timing right. That once the outside lag of policy is put into place, by the time you actually get something in and goes through, in the United States case, the congressional process, by the time it comes on stream, it's now no longer appropriate. Well, the current situation is such that most people forecast the recession to last, or the output gap anyway, to last a lengthy period of time. And so fears about mistiming of fiscal policy stimulus impacts are diminished. But in conclusion here, I think what I hope to have shown you here is that structural models like GIMF suggest that fiscal policy can play a considerable role in the economy and have played a considerable role in the economy, but that nothing's for free. That what you get in the short run is you're going to have to be paid for in the long run in lower levels of potential output and lower levels of consumption relative to potential output, unless one takes on policies that reverse the course of the permanent increase in debt. And that's the question that most Western economies have to decide what they're going to do about. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Kim McPhail, and I'm struck by, I guess, thinking about some of the parallels between the previous session and this session. And so my question is really to you, Tiff, I guess, principally. I'm thinking about how Mr. Cohn was saying that in the lead up to the financial crisis, had been a minimalist approach, which meant perhaps there was less awareness than there might otherwise have been, and fewer tools to deal with the crisis when it hit. And then I'm thinking about Dave's comments, where he was really talking about perhaps a bit of a Canada-US comparison, but also really talking about how there was with respect to central bank monetary policy, there's a pretty clear framework, policy framework, to deal with normal times, and that there had been some kind of gaps to deal with crisis times. And he saw that as part of the lessons learned being the completion of that policy framework to deal with those additional times. And my question for you, Tiff, in thinking about how you were describing the shift in mindset from thinking about policy, fiscal policy as kind of a long-term thing to more of a short-term thing to deal with these kinds of crisis situations, is when you think about the lessons learned, where do you think of things with respect to that policy framework, how complete it is, how robust it is to deal with not just the kind of medium-term goals, but the shorter goals and the implementation? You talked about kind of shovel, I'm not sure what the phrase was, shovel-ready projects. And, you know, so looking beyond kind of the exit strategy, but kind of further down the road, you know, crises happen from time to time. How do you see the lessons learned from this crisis to being able to deal with those future ones if they arise?
Well, I think the main lesson from this crisis is that although bubbles, crises have occurred and reoccurred over history, we can't, there's always a danger of forgetting the lessons of history. And we've got to take a number of actions to minimize the probability going forward. There's a very large agenda with respect to financial regulatory reform, which I'm quite involved in. And I think the key there is we've got to make sure we don't lose the momentum. We don't forget. You know, as you know, the reality is the financial system in many ways has recovered extremely well. A lot of that has to do with the support provided. The system, this has created increased moral hazard. We've got to drive that out. We need bigger buffers in our system. and Dave talked about a number of those. I think with respect to, I think one of the lessons from Canada's experience is that being in a good fiscal situation means that you have more capacity to use the tools available to mitigate the worst effects of crises. Canada, I mean, first of all, our financial system had bigger buffers that allowed us to weather the storm much better. And on the fiscal side, the fact that we had run, I showed the graph where the debt had gone up to a net basis, federal and provincial, roughly 100% of GDP. Well, in the subsequent roughly dozen years, we ran surpluses that whole period. And so that, it was down to about 30% of GDP. That meant that we were in a position where we could use the full force of fiscal policy to mitigate the crisis. And, I think the one lesson is that as economists, we tend to always make forecasts that revert to the mean, but you got to remember that bad things can happen, and you've got to make sure your system is designed to be resilient to bad things.
Chuck Friedman. Just one point I would like to make about Tiff's discussion of the 1990 Canadian episode, which also applies to Bob Tetlow's models. Tiff talked about the fact that monetary policy was able, once fiscal policy got turned around, to do what it was meant to do, which is to say the constraints that concerns about the fiscal situation put on the ability of the Bank of Canada to bring down short-term interest rates tended to then turn around and sort of become much less important. And indeed, we got interest rates down below US interest rates, something that a lot of market people thought was not possible. But the other half of the story is what happened to longer-term interest rates. And there, I think the default risk premium, or the sovereign risk premium, if you'd like, played a very important role. I remember sitting in the Bank of Canada, and for a while in 1996, virtually every week, the long-term rate relative to the US rates was coming down. That wasn't what the Bank of Canada was doing. That was the market responding to the increased credibility of the fiscal side in a way that was much faster than I would have anticipated. So that can be very, very important, and the events of the last 2 weeks show what can happen with this sovereign risk premium. The relevance, and I also want to emphasize the point that Tiff did make, which is we may not have some of the benefits of that going forward because interest rates are relatively low to start with. The relevance of that for Bob's discussions of the GIMF model, as a co-author of those two papers, you probably didn't see me in the second one because I was hidden among the 17. In the first one, by dint of working with co-authors whose names start with initials later than F, I get to be first author, they do not pick up on the credibility issue. And the very long period of time before the negative aspects show up, I think in reality would be shorter. And this could happen in two ways. One is for an individual country, call it Greece, Italy, whatever, having a much less credible and sustainable, perceived to be unsustainable fiscal path could mean substantial increase in interest rates, which could turn around that positive effect on output much more quickly than we anticipated. And that's not built into the models. And the second part is, this is a little bit more iffy. If the whole world has a very high debt to GDP level, savers may demand higher risk premiums to invest in general, and it is at least conceivable that you could have an overall risk premium for the world economy. World real interest rates could go up, which again could affect across the board. So I think that's a consideration just to be kept in mind.
Is that a question?
It was a comment on it. But if you want to talk to it, that's fine.
I don't have much to add. I guess what I would say from the point of view of sort of economics and what I think academics need to think about is that in more normal situations, market psychology is generally fairly well behaved, and the kind of assumptions and behaviors we build into our models is probably quite reasonable. But what we see is that when we get close to, we get into critical situations, market psychology becomes extremely important and highly unpredictable. and it really matters. And that, so, you know, these things can get, market psychology can make things very, very much worse when risk appetite evaporates and markets start to disappear. If you can then, however, if you can break that market psychology and you can get things back on track, it can also come back very quickly and things can restart very quickly. And, you know, to get to that famous, you know, G7 meeting in October of 2008, you know, the decision basically to say, well, there wouldn't be another Lehman. It was a view that we had to break, you know, the G7 had to break this negative market psychology, and I think it was the key turning point in starting to get onto the road to recovery. But it is a real challenge, I think, for you know, how do we reflect that in our more formal economics?
I agree with Chuck completely, and it's one of the common themes through everything that we've talked about so far, and I presume for the rest of the conference, is, especially in extreme times, and I'm just paraphrasing Tiff here, is there, in people's expectations, there are multiple equilibria, and most of what we do, whether it's trying to establish the credibility of fiscal policy or trying to stop a bank run in the wholesale market, it's all about ruling out the bad equilibrium and ensuring that people's beliefs focus on an equilibrium you like. Sometimes, and unfortunately, what we've had to do is make it up as we go along, and that's part of what Don's been talking about, is trying to set up the tools so that it's more reliable in the future. Joe?
Yes, Philip Hartman. I think that the quantifications of the effectiveness of fiscal policy, as we've seen them in both presentations, are extremely important in situations like the current. And I would not challenge the conclusion. I would actually share the conclusion that the crisis response from the fiscal side was very important in stabilizing most industrialist economies. I have, however, 2 or 3 interrelated questions about the frameworks we're using to do these quantifications. So my first question to Bob is, to which extent you believe that actually this type of frameworks we're using, based on accelerator type of frameworks, for example, actually approximate something which is a widespread financial instability, a systemic instability, and to the extent that it doesn't really capture this type of notion, how large the error, margin error, is around that. And the second question related to that is that which investments the IMF is doing in order to enhance the toolkit for quantifications of macroeconomic stabilization policies that actually try to have a qualitative change in developing frameworks that actually would represent widespread financial instabilities as an inherent part of macroeconomic models that actually do quantifications of these type of policies in these extreme circumstances.
That's a great and nasty question. I mean, you put your finger on a really critical issue, and the reason why it's nasty is because, you know, most macro models don't have much in the way of serious finance in them, and they didn't even have something like Bernanke or Gilchrist in them. And why is that? That's because the data didn't support that kind of thing. And why is that? That's because most of the time, finance just sits in the background doing its thing. It's just dual to what the expenditure side of the economy is doing. But when it's not dual, that's when you're in trouble. But unfortunately, fortunately in most respects, those events don't occur very often, and that means empirical verification of these kind of bubble-like, nonlinear processes are really hard to put into models. Add on to that the fact that we mostly know how to estimate models that have been linearized, and therefore are only really reliable in the neighborhood of that point around which they've been linearized, means that model uncertainty, which is always a problem, is even more of a problem when you're in a situation in an environment that you don't necessarily understand all that well. So I think the inclusion of things like Bernanke or Gilchrist in these models is certainly an important step forward. When you ask that question, if you're thinking about something like how large is the basin of attraction around our model? How far away from that equilibrium can we go before the world blows up? I mean, they're just not going to be able to tell you that. And I know that people are trying to work on those kind of things. I doubt if there'll be a lot. I'm not speaking here about inside the fund. I don't actually know. Normally I'm a Board of Governors, Federal Reserve Board of Governors guy. I'm visiting the IMF for a year, and I started 3 days ago. So I can't really tell you what's going on inside the fund about that. But I know in a broader academic environment, there are people working on models where agents are truly risk averse, are uncertainty averse. And that's, I think, going to be an important step forward to get to understanding how it is that you get agents who run for the door when something bad happens.
Mario Sikowicz from the University of Ottawa. I have actually a minor comment and also a question addressed to Tiff. Comment being that there are different interpretations as to what happened during the 1990s and the need for the kind of fiscal cutbacks that were implemented by Paul Martin at the time. I mean, we did have a serious recession that had been largely caused by, monetary policy in this case, in the early 1990s, and we had really high real interest rates throughout that period. And in fact, we were running pretty big fiscal surpluses already by the mid-1990s, primary surpluses, excuse me, by the mid-1990s. So a lot of that stuff would have happened anyways as we rode the coattail of the American economy in the late 1990s in terms of growth. But that's not the question I would like to ask you, which mostly to do in this case with what you yourself referred to, as well as your own boss there in a sense, which has to do with the fact that we do not have a structural deficit situation in Canada today in terms of federal fiscal situation. And therefore, why the concern really with an exit strategy? Why not have an automatic pilot situation really, in the sense that if indeed we do have no structural deficit to begin with, then presumably eventually with growth down the line, it will ultimately disappear. So why this big concern over the exit strategy?
Well, I guess I'd hope that the lessons playing out other places in the world would be sufficient to convince you that getting your debt levels down is extremely beneficial. As I mentioned, the fiscal stimulus was designed to deal with a very serious recession. And as you come out of the recession, you very naturally want to unwind that. I think the reason to take some additional measures that were taken in the budget is to, I mean, we know that there's a lot of uncertainty about forecasts going forward, and I think you want to provide some assurance that you will get back to balance. And the other thing I would mention is that going forward, we will have a rising proportion of the labor force retired. We will have lower labor force growth. We will have increased pressure on health care costs. And you want to be in a position where you get debt down before you have a big increase in your retired labor force to prepare for that.
Nick Rowe, Carleton. Just a quickie, Tiff and Bob. Why not temporary cuts in GST, VAT? And what sort of multipliers could we have expected from such a tax?
Why not temporary cuts in GST? I mean, the government had already reduced the GST prior, which actually turned out to be in the update of, let's see if I can get my years right, was it 2007? There's already been a move down the GST, and I think that turned out to be quite beneficial. As I mentioned, I tried to go through in some detail. The package that was put together was very much designed for maximum effectiveness, and I hope I laid it out pretty clearly.
Views on the multiplier? You're not going there?
The conventional theory tells you that if your tax cut is temporary, it's going to have a larger effect than if it's permanent, because people have to rush in to take advantage of it. But all that's going to do is just move some consumption from the future to today.
Mm-hmm.
So unless you get the timing of that exactly right, it's just going to produce a little wiggle in the data. You got a situation like this where your output gap's going to last a pretty lengthy period of time. If you're going to get that timing effect to work out well, you're going to have it for a long time, which means you're going to have to pay a lot up front for only a small benefit that's going to be crowded towards the end of the tax cut period. So it's not clear you'll get a lot of bang for your buck, but I haven't run the sim, so.
Chris Waddell, Carleton University. A question for Tiff Macklem. I wonder if you could for a second take your analysis of the role of fiscal policy and the exit strategy at the federal level and apply it to the provincial level in Canada, and wonder whether, because the spending issues are different and potentially the revenue raising capabilities are different as well, if it requires or proposes a different sort of solution.
Well, obviously, it's a big country, and there's different provinces that are in quite different situations. And they're in different kind of different steps in terms of addressing their own challenges. Clearly there are some important differences between provincial and federal structure of expenditures. Having said that, I think what I was trying to do in bringing out some broad lessons, I think they are fairly universal, not just the Canadian provinces, but would also be worth things that other countries that would have also big differences would be worth considering. And I think the message is that you don't want to let yourself get into a situation where you become vulnerable, because then what happens is that markets are going to dictate the pace and the speed at which you need to take measures. And you're much better off to act more ahead of that with a well thought through plan where you have more ability to take decisions in the best interest of your citizens.
Ian Lee, Carleton University. Dr. Macklem, I was intrigued by your comments about not kicking the problem down the road again. You just mentioned it in your answer, but it was in the end of your presentation, and addressing the problems as they occur rather than waiting. The PBO, and I think the PBO is here in the room, has shown some graphs showing the budget, the deficit is going to skyrocket in, I don't know, 5 or 7 years, whenever we boomers check out. And Dr. Dodge, the former governor, talked about the very, very tough choices that are going to have to be made. So I'm asking you to respond, perhaps hypothetically. What are the things, instead of kicking the problem down the road, waiting for that deficit to skyrocket, what are the things that could be done right now in terms of, I don't know, numbers, what percentage of cuts could be made in terms of GDP or federal government expenditure, or what could be done rather than just waiting for the problem to arrive on our doorstep in a few years' time?
One of my stock answers is I never answer hypothetical questions because they always get you into trouble. I think the way I would put it is that the budget measures the government has put together are very much there to avoid kicking the can down the road. And the reason it is important to bring the budget back to balance is precisely for that reason, that there are challenges to do with aging. You want to make sure you're in a position to, the higher the debt you have, the more you're going to pay for debt service, other things equal. And by getting it down, you've got the ability to maintain low taxes, which are good for the productivity of your economy. You can fund programs that are valuable to citizens. So there's been a lot of emphasis in Canada in ensuring that, to come back to this timely, targeted, and temporary, Those are very much the guiding principles. And I guess if I could put this out there, if you look at the fiscal consolidation plans of most other countries, they are less ambitious. And I think there's more of a risk that they're kicking the can down the road. And I'd encourage them to look at Canada.
Last question, David?
Dave Longworth. It's clear from some of the discussion that one wants to have a credible fiscal policy. But the question is, how do you make something credible? So I have two questions, one more related to Canada, which is how have the medium-term financial frameworks that have been put out over the course of the years helped in that regard? Do we think there's a lesson for other countries from that? And the second, from the other side, what's been wrong with Maastricht criteria in and of themselves? What would have made fiscal policy more credible in Europe? For both.
The second one's a really tough question. I think in the first one, I think credibility is achieved, whether it's monetary policy or fiscal policy. I think the simple principle is if you say what you're going to do and then you do it and you keep repeating that, you do gain credibility over time. And certainly, and the issue with credibility also is that you can lose it quickly and it takes time to get it back. So it's an asset, and you want to preserve it. I think in terms of fiscal credibility, I think the fact that Canada ran surpluses for roughly a dozen years built a lot of credibility, and there was a clear program of forecasting ahead what would be done, and when things turned out better, a large part of that was used to pay down further debt. I think there are things you can do, other things you can do to enhance credibility. I think when you're in a situation where you need to consolidate, being reasonably specific about rather than just put out a target, if you have a clear plan to how you're going to achieve that target, that will improve the credibility. On your second question, clearly the Europeans are thinking about this very hard as we speak. I think I don't have an answer for you right now to that one, to be frank. Europeans are very concerned about this. Clearly, they've taken some very bold actions in the last weekend, which we certainly very much welcome. They're needed. But there is now exactly the question you raise: how do we prevent this from happening again? That's going to be a very important issue going forward, and I know they're already deeply into that.
I'd love to respond, but I better not.
Okay, two quick announcements. First, as Bob has reinforced earlier, there is no such thing as a free lunch, but lunch will be served. There will be people to follow outside. Second, the copies of the cone paper this morning will be available outside that you'll pass on the way through. And lastly, I'd like to thank our two speakers today for giving us a two-handed session. Thank you very much.